A Listener's Guide to Johannes Brahms's Ein Deutsches Requiem. I'm Kent Cleland, Professor of Music Theory at the Baldwin Wallace Conservatory. Johannes Brahms's Ein Deutsches Requiem has been a masterwork of the Romantic choral repertoire for over a century and a half. The work is in 7 movements and is scored for soprano and bass soloists, chorus, and a full Romantic orchestra consisting of strings, a full complement of winds, 2 harps, and an optional organ. The first full performance of the work occurred on Good Friday, February 18, 1869, at the Leipzig Gewandhaus under the direction of Karl Reinecke. Performances of parts of the unfinished work occurred as early as 1866. The work expresses universal themes of comforting those who grieve over the death of a loved one. At the same time, the work is intensely personal, expressing the composer's grief over the loss of his mother, bringing her voice back through art to offer words of solace and encouragement. The German Requiem was a response to the deaths of 2 important people in Johannes Brahms's life. Brahms's mother, Johanna Brahms, with whom Brahms was very close throughout his life, passed away in 1865. Movements 1 and 4 were completed within a few weeks of his mother's passing, with movements 2, 6, and 7 following within 3 months. By August of 1866, all movements except the 5th were completed, this final movement being completed in April of 1868, 10 months before the premiere of the completed work. Brahms is reported to have worked quickly on the piece for the sake of providing some comfort through music to his sister on the loss of their beloved mother. The work might not have come about, however, if it weren't for another death 9 years earlier. Robert Schumann passed away on July 29, 1856, after a prolonged battle with both physical and emotional ailments. Brahms was very close with the Schumann family. They were early champions of his career, and he undoubtedly owed a great deal of his early success to the exposure they provided through their musical writings and sponsorship of performances of his work. The idea of a German requiem was found among Robert's papers following his death. In the following years, Brahms appears to have started to work out preliminary ideas of how sections of such a piece might work, though none of these crystallized into a completed composition. It was from these drafts and unfinished works that Brahms first drew when he began to work on the piece in earnest. To call this piece a requiem, much less a German requiem, belies the true nature and construction of the work. Despite calling the work a German requiem, the work bears little resemblance to traditional notions of requiem composition, and the label German belies what Brahms himself indicated as the intent of the work. A requiem mass is a special type of mass in the Roman Catholic rite. A true requiem is a series of prayers and readings that call for the elevation of a departed soul, so that it may rest with other righteous souls in the presence of St. Paul as they await the coming of Judgment Day. The focus is on the soul of the individual departed and asks for a specific form of salvation. Requiem masses have certain formulaic elements and texts, none of which are employed by Brahms in his work. Brahms's Requiem differs from the traditional Requiem in that it is a non-liturgical piece, or not intended for any particular church service. It uses texts in German from the Lutheran Bible instead of traditional Roman Catholic prayers in Latin, and it focuses not on the soul of the departed, but rather on relieving the grief of the bereaved who remain behind. As such, it more closely resembles a New Testament oratorio, more in the tradition of Handel's Messiah, in that it presents a series of tableaux and reflections from the New Testament that one may use for guided reflection on life, death, and grief. Even the adjective German is misleading for understanding this work. One might easily assume that the work is an expression of German nationalism, The use of the adjective German would likely have been understood at the time as an expression of support for the Prussian monarchy, under whom the unification of northern Germany was to be achieved within 5 years. Brahms was, by most reports, not a supporter of Prussian political dominance. Further, in a letter to Karl Rheintaler, who was organizing an 1868 performance of the 6 then-completed movements of the work at the Bremen Cathedral, Brahms wrote that the word Deutsches, German, referred only to the language used in the work, and that a better title might have been A Human Requiem, as he intended the work to deal with more universal expressions of grief. Johannes Brahms had a keen interest in the history of German music and drew from other examples of North German Protestant composers for source material. For example, some of the texts are the same ones chosen by Heinrich Schütz in his Musikalische Exequien. Robert Schumann not only provided the idea for the work, but he also provided a potential model for the architecture and structure of the work in his Requiem for Mignon of 1850. Finally, no discussion of Brahms' source material can be complete without some connection to Johann Sebastian Bach, of whose music he was an enthusiastic scholar. Brahms borrows material from Cantatas 106, Cantata 27, and the main theme of the first movement bears a striking resemblance to the chorale from Cantata 21, which Brahms had conducted in 1858 in Detmold. It is also interesting to note that this melodic theme seems to have had a consistent meaning for Brahms throughout his life, as he used it also in the themes to the 1858 Begräbnisgesang, or burial song, and in the second of the Vier Ernste Gesänge, 4 serious songs, of 1896. The texts of the Requiem all come from the Lutheran Bible. Being raised in strongly Lutheran northern Germany, Brahms undoubtedly would have been familiar with these texts. The texts he chose deal mostly with themes of comfort and grief, rather than on death itself. The 7 movements as a whole reveal a keen sense of the overall architecture and pacing of the work. The first 2 movements are largely expository, setting out the musical, textual, and dramatic themes which Brahms will develop in the 3rd through 6th movements. The musically, structurally, and dramatically intense 3rd movement is followed by the simplest movement in structure and design, allowing the listener time to process what he or she has just heard. The emotional center of the work, the 5th movement, is the most intensely personal movement, and is followed by what is perhaps the most musically intense and complex movement. The work as a whole finishes with a movement that returns not only to the key of the 1st movement, but also restates musical themes in a way that bring closure to the piece. Finally, Brahms utilizes several compositional elements that would have had a recognizable symbolic meaning to the listener of the day, especially in his use of traditional dances in several of the movements. The 1st movement, marked always slow and with emotion, serves as an exposition to the entire work, presenting the textual and musical themes that will be developed in later movements. For this movement, Brahms selected from Matthew chapter 5, verse 4, the seminal idea of the work, the blessing of the bereaved, who shall receive comfort in time. He pairs this with Psalm 126, chapter 5, verse 6, which introduces 2 important themes, the transformation of grieving into joy, and the metaphor of the gardener or planter who sows his seeds and awaits the ripening of his crop. Musically, Brahms sets these texts in a 3-part ABA form. The opening section in F major begins with a pulsing sensation much like a heartbeat in the lowest voices of the orchestra, followed by an ascending then descending 8-note scalar motive likely derived from the opening lines of the Lutheran chorale Wer nur den lieben Gott lässt walten. This first section presents a motivically significant figure of delayed resolution through the use of upper and lower stepwise dissonances, further illustrating the idea of allowing time to pass in order for one's grieving to bear fruit. The onset of the middle section sees a shift in tonality, a change in orchestration, and a change in the pacing of the presentation of the text. The tonality shifts suddenly to the distantly related key of D-flat major, a key area that was subtly suggested and foreshadowed by the use of deceptive cadences in the A section. This key presents a darker overall sound in the orchestra, which is balanced out by the addition of higher winds and harps. The opening material returns, initially in the wrong key of D-flat major, with the reintroduction of the text from Matthew. This final section follows essentially the same structure as the opening section, but the individual phrases and passages have been elongated, and it has picked up some of the rhythmic and orchestrational elements of the middle section, which remain a part of the texture through the end of the movement. The movement ends with a brief coda, which restates and reinforces the main theme of the work: "Those who grieve shall be comforted." The musical texture and orchestration foreshadows the musical transformation that is to come, the illustration of transforming darkness into light or sadness into joy. To do this, Brahms leaves the violins silent throughout the entire movement, creating a full but dark string texture through divided violas, celli, and basses. The use of winds is spare, as is the use of brass. Taken as a whole, the movement foreshadows the composition's major themes of darkness into light, grieving into joy, and conflict into peace, but all in their own time. The second movement is perhaps best thought of in two large sections, each with its own stylistic elements and form. Brahms chooses 4 texts to first expand on themes of waiting as a gardener for the ripening of his crop, and on the promise of the Lord to transform grief into joy. The first half of the movement begins with a selection from 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 25, which explicitly continues the agricultural metaphor. It is followed by a passage from James chapter 5, verse 7, that extols the virtue of patience. Brahms begins the movement in B-flat minor with a slow funeral march, a popular and familiar texture to audiences of the time. Against this, he juxtaposes 3 rhythmic figures that would have had specific meaning to an audience of his time. First, the triplet figure that pervades this section not only establishes the funeral march texture, but was also understood to be symbolic of death itself. Against this, Brahms first presents melodic material in the winds in a saraband rhythm, a dance of the noble classes. He follows this with the lilting rhythms of a Ländler, a peasant dance. Through this, Brahms symbolizes the idea that death connects all people, whether noble or common born. The choir sings the first text in unison, in its lower registers, creating a dark musical atmosphere that increases in intensity and volume as it climbs in register. The setting of the second text contrasts with the first in several ways. First, the key shifts to G-flat major. Second, the choir departs from its unison texture, presenting this text in full harmony. Brahms engages in some delightful text painting in this section, when the choir sings, "and patiently awaits the morning and evening rain." The orchestral texture shifts to a staccato presentation of constant eighth notes, punctuated by the sound of the harp. One can practically hear the sound of rain hitting the roof in this passage. The end of the first half of this movement returns to the opening funeral march, with accompanying textures in the original key, creating a 3-part ABA form. The second half of the movement changes character and texture dramatically. Brahms goes back to 1 Peter, this time chapter 1, verse 25, the verse that follows the text that opens this movement, to proclaim that God's word endures forever. He then selects a passage from Isaiah chapter 35, verse 10, that elaborates on God's promise that grief shall be transformed into joy. Musically, trumpets and brass announce the fidelity of God's promise and serve as a sort of musical transition to the setting of the Isaiah text, which is presented in a contrapuntal manner. The section begins and ends in B-flat major, portraying an image of the transformative hope that awaits the grief-stricken who are patient. If the first 2 movements may be thought of as expository, setting out the major themes, both musical and literary, with which Brahms will grapple, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th movements have a much different role. These movements, taken together, form the intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic heart of the work. The third movement presents texts from Psalm 39, verses 4 through 7, and chapter 3, verse 1 of the Song of Solomon. The psalm text reads like a lesson in understanding mankind's impermanence. Accordingly, Brahms sets this text much in the manner of a church school lesson, with the baritone soloist taking the role of the teacher and the chorus being the students. The baritone soloist is heard for the first time intoning 4 separate lessons. First, a prayer to God for understanding of one's human frailty and the nature of death. Second, the insignificance of one's life in the greater context of God's workings. Third, a repeat of the opening prayer, forming an ABA structure to open the movement. And fourth, a change in musical texture that accompanies the next lesson, which addresses the useless vanity of mankind. Each lesson is presented first by the baritone soloist, who acts as a sort of teacher, and is then repeated both textually and musically by the chorus, much like students reciting their lessons. This opening section ends with the baritone soloist asking the important question, the why question that brings his lesson to a close. Lord, how am I to find comfort? Which is also dutifully repeated by the choir. A transitional passage, shifting from the dark D minor that has pervaded the movement thus far to a much brighter D major, presents the last line of the psalm text, My hope is in you, Lord. The text from the Song of Solomon is a statement meant to comfort the grieving by promising that the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment shall touch them. Brahms sets this text in a grand four-voiced pedal fugue, or a fugue in which a single note, in this case the tonal center of D, sounds constantly in the texture. The fourth movement presents a contrast to the questioning and drama composed into the third movement. Following the intensity of the grand pedal fugue, Brahms employs a simple waltz in the key of E-flat major throughout. The text is from Psalm 84, verses 1, 2, and 4, How lovely is thy dwelling place. This movement is unique in the context of the entire work, in that first, it maintains only one consistent and simple style throughout, and it utilizes only one text, a text that deals only with praising God. And the use of a waltz was meant to musically portray the beauty and elegance of heaven, as a waltz was associated with the upper classes. The serenity and simplicity of this movement stands in contrast to the musical complexity that precedes it and the spiritual complexity that follows it. The fifth movement, in G major, was the last of the movements in the work to be completed. It is also perhaps the spiritual center of the work and the most personal in nature. Brahms sets texts from John chapter 16, verse 22, and Ecclesiastes chapter 51, verse 27, for soprano soloist. The choir repeats a line from Isaiah chapter 66, verse 13, in between the soprano soloist's passages. The soprano, representing the voice of Brahms's mother, Johanna, promises that I will see you again, that joy will return, and that she has found rest. The choir repeats the line, I will comfort you as one who is comforted by his mother. The soloist adds one line at the end that is not taken from Scripture. Following the conclusion of the repeat of the passage from John, the soloist sings, using the familiar form of goodbye, Wiedersehen, that one would use with loved ones. If the fifth movement was the emotional climax of the work, the sixth serves as the musical climax. This movement is the largest in scale, setting 3 separate texts that present both a progression and culmination in thought. First, Brahms selects a text from Hebrews chapter 13, verse 14, that speaks both of having no permanent home on earth and of the seeking or longing for one. Brahms sets this text with tonally ambiguous harmonies and a constantly wandering bass line that portray musically the searching theme of the text. The baritone soloist, again acting as teacher, returns to once again present a lesson from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. As in the third movement, the choir dutifully repeats the teacher's lesson about how we shall be transformed at the sounding of the last trumpet. The choir finishes this section of text, proclaiming that the trumpet shall sound and we shall be transformed. The baritone soloist then returns in a recitative texture, preparing for the final choral statement of this section of text. The triumphant music is a modified restatement of the melodic material from the second movement, when the chorus in unison sang about all flesh being like grass, which withers and falls away. This time the music is triumphant, fully harmonized, and much faster than the earlier presentation. Brahms sets the final section of text as a grand double fugue in C major. The text, taken from Revelation chapter 4, verse 11, is another song of praise to the glory of the Lord. Brahms includes some interesting moments of text painting and references to earlier musics in this section. The fugue subject begins with a traditional long, short, canzona rhythm. While unremarkable on its surface, this may have been an acknowledgement of the work of Schubert, as Schubert was known to use this rhythm as a sort of death motive in many of his works. At the completion of the first sentence of text, Brahms introduces a new fugal subject, which he intersperses with restatements of the text, "You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power." The final movement returns to F major, presenting a final statement from Revelations chapter 14, verse 13, that those who die in the name of the Lord are blessed, and a prayer that they may rest from and be remembered for their good works on earth. The movement remains slow and stately throughout, finally returning to melodic material presented initially in the first movement, much like the final rhyme of a poem. This movement changes the focus from prayers for the grieving to prayers for the dead, as if, by going through the reflections and texts of the previous 6 movements, those who had grieved have now been made whole, and the focus of one's prayers can now shift to the soul of the departed. The final moments bring a stark and moving recollection of the opening moments from the beginning of the first movement, now transformed from agitation and uncertainty to a calming peace. The journey for the bereaved is complete. Brahms's German Requiem served an important role in elevating the reputation of the composer, as it quickly became recognized as a masterwork in the Romantic choral orchestral literature. Acceptance, however, was neither immediate nor universal. 2 trends seem to have occurred, one religious and one aesthetic. The German Requiem was more quickly embraced and programmed in Protestant rather than in Catholic areas. This is not surprising given the work's overtly Lutheran text and approach to its main themes. Ironically, the first incomplete performance of the work was in Catholic Vienna, and helped to expand Brahms's reputation in the city from that of an interpreter of Baroque choral works to one of a legitimate compositional voice in his own right. Nevertheless, the work saw more rapid acceptance in Protestant areas of Germany, and later in other Protestant countries in Europe than in Catholic areas. Religious concerns about the work were centered around the question of whether the work was appropriate for the concert hall as well as the church, as some critics noted an academic quality that was often described as a lack of sensuousness. Noted German critic Eduard Hanslick wrote, "I think it is as much as intentional avoidance of everything sensuous as it is a fault. His Requiem is nobly spiritual and so Protestant Bacchish that it was difficult to make it go down here." While the piece was criticized in Catholic parts of German lands for its lack of sensuality or passion, in Protestant areas it was a perceived mystical and supernatural quality that drew the most criticism. Politically, the work quickly became associated with a more conservative and historically based perspective on musical aesthetics. The musical landscape in Germany in the late 1860s was one of divided factions, with supporters of a more progressive musical language, represented by the music of Wagner and Liszt, debating with supporters of a more conservative approach for whom Brahms's music set an example. As a result, initial reception of the German Requiem was mixed, largely along party lines. Richard Wagner specifically noted the work in one of his criticisms of Brahms. He opposed the Protestant bourgeois themes that he perceived in the work, and he also seemingly misinterpreted Brahms's intention by assuming that the word German was an expression of nationalism, the type of which he wanted no part. The crux of the political issue was often perceived reliance on historical antecedents. The conservatives saw music as growing out of a long, proud, and established tradition, while the progressives saw the past as a limit to one's artistic creativity. The German Requiem was universally seen as a rising out of past antecedents. One commentator noted that vocalists who trained to sing Bach were better able to handle Brahms's choral works, such as the Requiem. An 1877 review in the New York Times stated that the work is exceedingly scholarly, but its length and monotonousness are such that it is scarcely likely to impress any but students. The German Requiem today is an established piece in the standard repertoire, enjoying numerous performances worldwide every year. More importantly, with this piece, Brahms established a new genre of work, the secular Requiem, that utilizes a broader range of texts than prescribed by the traditional Catholic liturgy. Works that extend this tradition include a stunningly beautiful Requiem by English composer Herbert Howells, a large and diverse Requiem by Leonard Bernstein, and Benjamin Britten's famous War Requiem, among others. Each of these works expands on the idea of a large choral work that uses a variety of texts to examine a particular aspect of death and grieving.